Yeah, I mean, there is a strand of thought on the right that basically it largely agrees with me that there is no obvious contender to rescue us in the next 5, 10, 20 years, and that actually a Labour government as an accelerationist force to sort of plunge us into this darkness is just necessary because the only way out is through. And that, it's going to take a black swan event. And I think, one of my other, one of the other drums that I'm constantly banging is net zero and how it is increasing instability in the grid. I don't know if you remember, I think it was about 2012, 2013, but we had a winter where there was an anticyclone across the entirety of the country. And never mind your real feel, the temperature plummeted to -6, even in sort of relatively temperate places like Bath. And every single windmill in the country stopped working, and we were down on gas, and it was like that for days, weeks, in fact. And the grid was teetering on the brink. And since then, we built new interconnectors. But, if these weather systems can subsume the whole of Europe. Now, if that happens sometime in the next 10 years, while we're still prattling about with windmills and we haven't built any new nuclear, it's entirely, they're already looking at energy rationing and demand side management, but they're going to just start shutting down heavy industry in winter. And that's going to, and they think they can do that. They think they can do that without consequence. The previous prediction was that we were going to see blackouts. And I think that can be avoided. But they're going to do it by telling heavy industry what's left of it is, oh, you just need to power down for just this week and a little bit into next week. And then there'll be a state subsidy to pay them to power down. But actually, businesses can't just decide to not fulfill their orders. They've got to be reliable. They've got to be dependable. And if there's even minor perturbations, that can destroy their profit margin. Even if their profit margin is just like 2 or 3%, if it wipes that out, they're done. And so this is going to gradually build and build, putting people out of work. With the onset of the sort of social strife caused by immigration, compared with the industrial decline, there comes a point where all these factors meet in a perfect storm, and that's when you start seeing serious disintegration. So this darkness that you're talking about, we are heading for it, but and of course the great signal that's upcoming is the Euro elections. It could be anywhere up to 25% of MEPs will be from populist or far right parties. You start looking at some genuinely scary movements that are arriving. Slovakia, Italy, Germany. I mean, particularly Italy. I've seen a video recently of quite a large crowd marching, goose stepping, giving the Hitler salutes, and all of that. And this is not. The debate in this country is like anyone who's vaguely conservative is accused by Hope Not Hate of being far right. And, even if you're a gender critical campaigner, you get branded as transphobic and far right and yada, yada, yada. But actually on the continent, what we're seeing, there's no misnomer here. What we are looking at here is the beginnings of good old fashioned European fascism. And they're trying to put a lid on it. The EU is trying to control the narrative and set up anti-disinformation units, and they're just going to fold. There's nothing that the European establishments can do that can withstand the kind of resentment and anger that's growing. Particularly in Italy, where you look at how its outer islands are just colonized by tens of thousands of economic migrants that cannot be, we're talking zero skill, subliterate people who simply they cannot contribute economically or socially. They can't even abide by basic conventions such as not shitting in the street and not raping women. And so the thing is, if you look at the dissident right in Britain, it tends to be sort of semi-autistic, middle-aged Gen X geeks who tend to be white, who tend to be male, like us do. You look at all of these upstart parties, they're all completely dominated by white men of a certain age who see what's happening to their country, and we're outspoken and ridiculed, and it's going to stay that way for quite a long time. Over in Europe, though, it's different because they've had a far more intensive surge of third world immigration, and the penny is dropping with the women on the continent. That this kind of immigration represents not just a general cultural threat to their income. They are in danger. They're in personal danger. And when that penny drops with the women and they start joining these movements, that's when you've got the basis of one. Right now in Britain, you tend to find some of the worst excesses of wokery and the bleating of the mantra that trans women are women. It's not men, it's women.
It's middle class, liberal women.
Yeah, middle class, well-to-do women. And what we've got is a feminized middle class, because a lot of them work in academia, the civil service.
It's gynocentric, isn't it?
Public sector, and their only encounter with foreigners are similar to them. Middle class academics, perfectly integrated. They don't understand the difference between the immigration that they experience and the immigration that the working class in the slums of Manchester and London experience. And so you've got this feminized middle class politically dominated by women, and they are the liberals the Waitrose liberals who vote Green, Lib Dem, or Labour Party, and they are the obstacle, they are the barriers, and they are the ones joining the NGOs and refugee charities. They're the human rights lawyers. They're the ones who will call men like you and me far right. They are the enemy.
They're the Labour Party.
And you can see how rapidly this unfolds, because once the Cass report comes out, the dominoes start to fall. And so you get people sort of suddenly realizing, oh, I hadn't realized, or I hadn't quite understood, and I was wrong. And then as soon as 2 or 3 celebs so join and say, I was wrong, the floodgates open. And we're going to see the same. It's got to get to an emergency level. And I think it will be perhaps if the Israel-Gaza war gets worse, or if there's a war between, say, Pakistan and India, some event will happen where the middle class liberal tendency will start to wake up.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it might be the beginnings of that might be happening, because if you look at some of the profile of the SDP, these are these left-leaning, quite nice middle-class people. I call the SDP Waitrose UKIP. And they're not quite right-wing, they're left-leaning. And they are going to be the people who reach into the areas where we can't, where they can argue the point that actually this level of immigration is unsustainable, and they can start chomping away. So I think they serve a purpose, and they certainly seem to know what they're doing. So I would support their efforts. But ultimately, our job is to overcome not the immigrants, but the stupidity, vanity, liability of white middle class English people who just do not recognise the danger, and that's pivotal to it. Once the women start joining our cause,
Yeah,
and they will.
they will. Yes, yes. It's once their kids are in danger. Once their kids are in danger, then they'll begin to shift. And it's ironic, I have been, I guess, fortunate enough to mix with quite a few people from the upper class. The upper class and the lower class are almost in alignment.
Yes,
it's the middle.
Yeah,
it's the middle. It's the problem. And everyone goes in England. There's still even people who are quite ethno centric, or they're kind of conservative, or they're still railing because the Marxist indoctrination of the class struggle in England. And look, I came from it. Anyone who had a posh accent was gentry and to be despised and hated and all. I lived it, but I've met a lot of the upper class, and they're generally very humble, very kind, very nice, very charitable, and they have the exact same concerns. And they love the country in exactly the same way. And it's the middle class who are living in a kind of ever aspiring circles of delusion that they do not want that bubble to be touched upon,
You saw this during Brexit, where you've got your middle class liberal Remainer, and you look at all of their complaints about Brexit, and every single one of them comes down to how Brexit personally interrupts or disrupts their personal consumption habits.
Where will I get my Prince sandwich?
For going on holiday, whether they can get cheap food, whether they can get cheap au pairs, whatever. It's this narrow, entirely selfish, self-centered bubble, and it's reflected in they keep saying, oh no, we need to rejoin the EU because everything that's bad that's happened since is all a consequence of Brexit, and it will all be fixed by rejoining the EU. But they're not looking at what the EU's been doing. The EU has, under the guise of net zero, has declared war on fertilizer production. Oh, and guess what? That has an effect on food prices. Who'd have thought? And then punishing farmers for using certain pesticides. And then forcing everyone into EVs that nobody wants to buy. And so personal mobility costs are going up. Who'd have thought it? And now that we're seeing the German auto industry is collapsing. And then they said, oh, right, let's not build power stations. Let's knock down our nuclear power stations and build intermittent windmills. Oh dear, we seem to be short of energy now that Mr. Putin has invaded Ukraine. Who could possibly have seen that coming? The sheer unrelenting stupidity of European elites has done more damage to the German manufacturing capability than the combined efforts of the United States 8th Army Air Force and Bomber Command.
Bomber Harris would be proud.
We couldn't have dreamed of collapsing German manufacturing the way that the environmental net zero policies have.
That's communism.
So, these policies have absolutely trashed Europe's capacity to feed itself and to keep the lights on. There's a Deutsche Welle video exploring whether blackouts in Germany are a remote possibility. And it's quite comprehensive. You would never see that kind of analysis of the British National Grid done on the BBC. They're more likely to field some idiotic green lobbyist to say how wonderful windmills are. But Deutsche Welle has done a serious investigation, and their experts, all of their National Grid experts, are saying, this is causing these windmills that don't work. They're causing major intermittency, and we're not sure that now we can't get cheap Russian gas. We're not sure we can keep the lights on, and this is
It's complete
so once you start putting all the pieces together of economic decline, destroying their own capacity to manufacture, what you've also got is the carbon border tax, because they're over-regulating their own industries to the point where you reach out to China and India to import instead. So they're undermining their own industries. So what they're going to do is put the carbon border tariff on, which is on steel, cement, and all the things that you might need to build power stations. So, and then they're going to put carbon counting and carbon credits on, and all kinds of regulatory nonsense on the planning, which is going to mean building power stations takes longer, costs more, and it costs billions before the first JCB reports to site. So put all the pieces together. You're destroying your own manufacturing. You're boosting your enemies abroad. You're making it harder to renew your own already archaic infrastructure. Meanwhile, you've got a cost of living crisis, a jobs crisis, and an underlying demographic anxiety and the growing far right. Well, you do the math. What do your instincts tell you about the destination of all this? Probably the same as mine.
Yeah. So if you go back to 2001, there was 2 Chinese generals retiring from the Chinese military, and their gift to the nation was a 25-year war strategy to take over the West without kinetic combat. That completes in 2026, and it involved political infiltration, trade infiltration, propaganda. Which in TikTok is part of this. It involved hijacking oil, various forms of industrial espionage, because militarily, they know they can't defeat the West man to man.
Yeah, they just probably could now.
Well, their army's conscripted and large, and pardon the French, bit crap.
As opposed to ours, which doesn't exist.
Ours is, well, yeah, but we still have pound for pound. So they knew they couldn't compete on a military basis. The US would destroy them. So they've gone about in another way. Now, there's a guy called Craig Hamilton put out a book in 2020, I think, called The Hidden Hand. And he goes through all the political infiltration of the West by the Chinese government. And essentially, Britain and Germany are the 2 most infiltrated countries in the world by the Chinese government.